Luego nos pusieron un número en el brazo. A partir de ese momento, éramos solo un número. Después, llegamos al pabellón de los experimentos.
While Auschwitz has gained worldwide notoriety as the ultimate symbol of the Holocaust, Ravensbrück represents a lesser recognized yet equally atrocious facet of Nazi barbarism. Behind its barbed wire and tall watchtowers, this concentration camp, exclusively designed for women, witnessed countless acts of cruelty and suffering. However, there was also space for resistance there. The evil unleashed at Ravensbrück surpasses what is imaginable to the human mind, reaching levels of depravity and genocide that defy comprehension. In addition to torture, multiple mutilations, mass murders, and summary executions were carried out in this camp, along with forced labor, humiliations, experimentation with extermination methods, starvation, and public humiliations. Some prisoners were forced to abort, while others had to give birth under conditions of absolute insanity. These atrocities were compounded by well-known mass murders in gas chambers and medical experiments that included forced sterilization. This happened under the watchful and complicit compliance of other women, the fierce Nazi guards who oversaw the camp. Explore with us Ravensbrück, a harrowing tale of torture and suffering that also reminds us of the immensely powerful human capacity to survive, even in the most extreme conditions. Nacht und Nebel, night and fog in German, was a sinister term used by the Nazis to designate those prisoners destined to disappear into the darkness of night and the silence of fog in the camps. In addition to being deprived of all freedom, these prisoners were condemned to live in a voiceless world, disconnected from the outside, and in inhuman conditions that preceded the gas chambers. With the euphemism, night and fog, they named more than 132,000 women who passed through Ravensbrück during the Second World War. This female concentration camp received prisoners of various nationalities, including British and American. It is estimated that around 50,000 of them never managed to escape from the brutality and sadism perpetrated by the SS guards. Among the prisoners were those involved in the black market, as well as brave women who openly defied the Nazi regime, from Jewish couples to women dedicated as nuns. From the moment of their arrival, the women were subjected to sexual abuse and relentless dehumanization. Survivors' testimonies painfully narrate the humiliations suffered, ranging from forced stripping to brutal beatings.
Había gente que no se querían morir. Caminaban y se caían, y se levantaban, y caminaban, y caían. No se querían morir.
Now the question is, why isn't Ravensbrück talked about as much? Beyond the testimonies that confirm the countless atrocities inside the camp, the data is confusing. All documents were burned in a bonfire or in the crematorium ovens and thrown into the depths of the lake next to the camp. The contrast between inside and outside was ominous. While they had thousands of women locked up, Heinrich Himmler, the second highest-ranking leader of the Third Reich, was obsessed with having concentration camps built in beautiful landscapes. At the darkest moment of the war, 45,000 women lived confined in the barracks of the camp in conditions of extreme overcrowding, since the Nazi leader had ordered the construction of a small-sized camp, despite warnings from colleagues like Rudolf Höss, who reminded him that if war broke out, they would quickly run out of space. A curious fact is that only 10% of the prisoners were Jewish. Instead, the majority of its initial 2,000 inhabitants were Germans who had opposed Hitler. Among these early residents, a populous group of 500 Jehovah's Witnesses stood out, who considered Hitler the Antichrist and had already been through the Moringen camp before it was converted into a youth prison. Their faith in God rather than in the Führer led them to Ravensbrück. The hidden location of this women's camp was another reason why, for many decades after the war, little was spoken about what happened there. Himmler ensured that access to the campgrounds was deliberately far from the gaze of travelers. The apparent tranquility of Ravensbrück with peacocks walking around and monkeys hanging from trees, and even the presence of a parrot that repeated words, was observed by some visitors who arrived at the camp without knowing its true nature. This almost idyllic scene, far from the common perception of a concentration camp, concealed the brutal living conditions of the prisoners. Added to this was what was already very common in other extermination sites: the use of phonographs at maximum volume playing classical music to drown out the horrifying cries of agony and pain. After the end of the war, and before the fall of the Berlin Wall, Ravensbrück remained in East Germany, the Soviet-controlled part, which made it off-limits for Western historians for years, who wanted to verify with their own eyes what some testimonies recounted. Despite the few proofs, fortunately for history and memory, some of these women survived hell and were able to testify to the reality.
Te sacaban de la cama a las 7 por la mañana. Esto era la muerte, porque cuando hay -12, -13, y no puedes más soportar porque no tienes nada, tienes este traje y el número aquí, y solo con esto teníamos que ir a trabajar.
Annette KlLLED's shocking account details the savage practices that all the Ravensbrück prisoners faced in captivity. It was commonplace for a handful of them to be whipped in front of crowds once a day as a form of intimidation. Some endured more than 25 lashes, a brutality that could be life-threatening. In addition to this physical violence, the women were subjected to horrific punishment conditions, such as being confined in flooded cells that caused hypothermia. To make matters worse, the medical experiments they suffered included drug testing without consent, deliberate infections, and intentionally caused bone fractures. One of these infamous procedures involved testing sulfonamides, a prototype for antibiotics. To do this, they first cut the women's bones, muscles, and nerves to infect them with bacteria through pieces of wood or glass, and then experimented with sulfonamide. Another grim experiment was the attempt to transplant bones from one woman to another, which in most cases left them mutilated. The putrefying wounds and excruciating pain led to the death of numerous prisoners at Ravensbrück, while those who survived were forever scarred with irreparable damage. Forced sterilization was another atrocity committed against women, often under deception and without their consent. Guards, including women who later faced trial for their crimes, were responsible for administering this suffering on a daily basis. Lesser-known humiliating treatment included the exhaustive gynecological examinations carried out on prisoners in deplorable and unsanitary conditions. The merciless guards used the same instrument, examining and taking samples from all prisoners, regardless of whether any of them had diseases such as tuberculosis or syphilis. Believe it or not, female prisoners were subjected to something far worse. Survivor Leah Zajac agrees with many of her companions in saying that there was a macabre torture that is impossible to forget: hunger.
Allí en el gueto ya empieza mi primer peldaño del infierno, porque empiezo con el terrible, incontable, y no se puede, el que no lo vivió no puede imaginarse lo que significa el hambre que me tocó vivir durante 4 largos años.
In addition to its function as a place of detention, Ravensbrück served as a training center for female guards, teaching them to impose a reign of terror over the inmates. Under the supervision of commanders like Max KlLLED and Fritz Siron, the camp had a staff of approximately 150 SS guards, responsible for the daily surveillance of the prisoners. Many of these soldiers were transferred to other camps, such as Auschwitz, where they continued to perpetrate acts of brutality. Upon arrival at Ravensbrück, prisoners were assigned a colored triangle indicating their category and origin, and their hair was shaved off, an act that was both physically and psychologically traumatic. In the Third Reich, although lesbian relationships were not explicitly prohibited like homosexual relationships between men, some women were sent to concentration camps for belonging to groups considered antisocial. This was due to social disapproval and reports from their communities, rather than directly for their sexual orientation. Lesbians were not perceived as a threat and were mainly seen as potential mothers of racially pure children. Regarding the internal organization of the camp, it was structured into 5 areas: the commander's office, the political department, the protective custody sector, administration, and a limited medical care zone. In just 7 years of the camp's existence, there were 3 directors at Ravensbrück, resulting in constant changes in leadership and the deepening of increasingly ruthless extermination policies. From December 1938 to April 1939, SS Colonel Günther Tamaschke was in charge of Ravensbrück. Starting from January 1, 1940, SS Captain Max Kugel officially took over as camp commander, succeeding Tamaschke. Then, on August 20, 1942, Captain Fritz Sören assumed the position as the new commander, holding the position until late April 1945. The functioning of the camp was meticulously organized. The main area consisted of 18 barracks. 2 functioned as infirmaries, another 2 as warehouses, 1 as a punishment block, and 1 more as a prison until a separate facility was built in 1939. The remaining huts served as housing for the prisoners, where they slept on 3-tier bunk beds. Despite having washrooms and toilets, the sanitary conditions were extremely poor, deteriorating significantly due to the increasing number of inmates after 1943. Food rations were meager from the beginning and decreased further in both quantity and quality from 1941 onwards. By January 1945, the barracks were terribly overcrowded, exacerbating the already deplorable hygienic conditions, which led to a typhus epidemic spreading rapidly throughout the camp. At the peak growth of the camp, the vast number of hostages overflowed the capacity of the rooms, as Judith Becker mentions in her testimony.
In Ravensbrück, they didn't put us into any of the barracks. They right away straight put us into the Totenbark, into a barrack for death, for killing. And the method they used was that into an area that that could hold 100 people, they put 1,500. And there was no room to stand. There was no furniture in the place. There was no room to stand, so some people were hanging in the air.
Due to this overcrowding, the SS authorities subjected the prisoners to periodic selections, where those deemed too weak or injured to work were isolated and murdered. Initially, chosen inmates were cowardly shot. However, starting in 1942 as part of Operation 14F-13, the SS transported them to the Bernburg Sanatorium, equipped with gas chambers previously used for the Nazi regime's euthanasia program. Around 1,600 prisoners, including Jews, Roma, and Jehovah's Witnesses, were sent to their deaths at Bernburg in the spring of 1941. Subsequently, in 1942, a second wave of killings began in these euthanasia centers, continuing until 1944. During this phase, approximately 60 convoys departed from the extermination camp to the euthanasia center in Hartheim, Austria, transporting between 60 and 1,000 prisoners each. Additionally, SS personnel also carried out killings in the camp infirmary, using lethal injections or by sending prisoners to the Auschwitz-Birkenau extermination center. In early 1945, the SS installed a gas chamber at Ravensbrück, where between 5,000 and 6,000 prisoners were murdered before the Soviet liberation in April 1945. Prisoners at the camp documented the horrors they endured through clandestine photographs. Many were selected to be forced into brothels for military personnel. The rest were condemned to forced labor, with approximately 3,600 executed at Okermark Mansion. Despite everything, horror did not extinguish hope. At Ravensbrück, women forged strong bonds of solidarity that provided invaluable emotional and physical support. These connections gave them the strength to face despair, endure grueling forced labor, and withstand torments specifically directed at them as women. Sorority and collaboration among the prisoners became a powerful mechanism of survival, offering them a ray of hope amidst the Nazi night and fog. Within the camp, some seamstresses found refuge in their joint work. Despite the long hours, being part of this select group gave them an identity beyond the number tattooed on their arms. Their companionship restored a sense of humanity and hope amid the desolation of the concentration camp. Sewing skills became an invaluable resource for many of them. Through their mastery of the craft, they kept the hope of freedom alive. Although they could not afford mistakes, The intimate atmosphere and conversations reminded them of their humanity and provided a respite from the brutality surrounding them. Luck also played a crucial role in the prisoners' survival. Despite being strong and resilient, they needed a stroke of fortune to safeguard their lives in such a hostile environment. The light at the end of the tunnel was finally seen on April 27, 1945. Ravensbrück was evacuated under Nazi orders. A column of 20,000 prisoners was abandoned by the SS in Malo. The horrors ended when the Red Army liberated the main camp on April 30th and the subcamps on May 3rd. At that time, survivors rarely shared their experiences, leaving many stories of trauma in silence. A year later, in 1946, the Hamburg trials took place where guards accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity were sentenced to death, but it took decades for the full testimonies to be heard. It is important to remember that justice continues to pursue those who participated in atrocities during the Second World War. Elfriede Lena Rinkel, a German citizen, was deported in 2006 after admitting her involvement as a guard at Ravensbrück. Her expulsion underscores the commitment to justice in prosecuting Nazi perpetrators and holding them accountable under the law. Through the efforts of the Office of Special Investigations, former participants in Nazi persecution residing in the United States continue to be identified, investigated, and legally pursued. Aside from the bloodthirsty Rinkel, more than 100 individuals have been prosecuted for their complicity in Nazi crimes. Although the damage is irreparable and justice comes late, the survivors of Ravensbrück recounted their experiences with superhuman strength. While in the extermination camps, some of them cultivated poetry writing as a means of relief and healing. These poems were like secret messages, filled with longing and pain, written on scraps of paper under difficult conditions. Today, their texts reach us as cries for help from the past, hoping to be heard and remembered. Poetry in the concentration camps not only became a means of individual and collective expression, but also a tool to keep alive the memory of those who suffered and died in darkness. A constant call from the past for humanity, never to forget its capacity for both suffering and hope.
But our Sturmälteste, and this is why I maintain all the time that humanity did not die during the war.
Despite everything, even in the hell of Ravensbrück, humanity did not die yet, and from all the scars and pain, the highest resilience always stands out. Thank you very much for staying until the end. We look forward to seeing you in the next installment. Share this video with anyone you think might be interested, and subscribe now to access more impactful and revealing stories about the Holocaust. Don't miss the opportunity to discover the truth behind one of the darkest chapters in history. Until next time.